We're studying Proverbs, and I heard a really good analogy. You can take the picture off of. Yeah, thank you. I heard a really good analogy about Proverbs this week. You know, often Scripture is compared to food. You have verses like Jeremiah 15:16, where Jeremiah says, "When your words came, I ate them." Or you hear Paul talk about, "Hey, when I first came to you, I gave you spiritual milk that you needed." Or he'll say, "By now you should be on to eating the meat of the Word." The Scripture is often referred to as food. And someone was comparing Proverbs. Proverbs are like the hard candy of Scripture, like the Jolly Ranchers. You can't just bite down on them. You can't just immediately digest them. You have to sort of turn them over in your mouth for a while, and slowly they start to dissolve, and you start to digest them. That is a lot how Proverbs is. And so this summer, as we've been working our way through, we've been hitting different topics and sort of chasing them all around topics like anger, like parenting, like the tongue, like discipline, just all these different topics we've been sort of chasing around. And most of them have been Proverbs from King Solomon. When we think of the book of Proverbs, we often think of King Solomon as the author, which for the majority of them, he was. But there are a number of other sets of sayings in the book of Proverbs that aren't from King Solomon. Either King Solomon sort of latched onto them and he started incorporating them with his sayings, or someone after King Solomon sort of attached them with the sayings of Solomon, and they ended up in our book of Proverbs. And so this morning, we're going to look at a section from one of these other guys, a guy named Agur, A-G-U-R. If you want to open up to Proverbs chapter 30, the 33 verses of chapter 30 all come from this guy named Agur. The sayings of Agur, we have no idea who he is. All we know about him comes from these 33 verses. And towards the end of that chapter, he has 5 verses that go together. And so unlike we've done with the other topics where we've sort of jumped around Proverbs, chasing that topic around, today we're just going to be in these 5 verses because they sort of form a little sermonette inside of this book. And so I want us to look at these 5 verses and to sort of turn them over in our mouths like the hard candy and see if we can dissolve them and digest them. Now it's interesting the approach he takes. It's very counterintuitive. If I were to ask you, who do you want to model your life after? Most of us are going to look up. We're going to look to some sort of hero, some sort of celebrity, some famous person, maybe a musician or something, somebody who emulates success, something we're interested in, and we're going to say, man, I want to be like them. That's what most of us would do. And yet Agur, in this message, he changes that. And he encourages us not to look up, but to look downward. And so if you haven't already, in Proverbs 30, we're going to begin 24, we're going to discover that instead of encouraging us to look up, Agur's encouragement is to look down. He's going to look at 4 different members of the animal kingdom, and he's going to say, hey, what can we learn from them? Not something most of us would usually do, but by the time we're done, I think we're going to be saying, thank you, Agur, for helping us. So let's just read it before we go any further. Proverbs 30, starting in verse 24. 4 things on earth are small, yet they are extremely wise. Ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. Hyraxes are creatures of little power, yet they make their home in the crags. Locusts have no king, yet they advance together in ranks. A lizard can be caught with the hand, yet it is found in kings' palaces. Now, just to see if you're paying attention, anyone want to guess the number of points that this message is going to have today? 4. Not terribly complicated. With each animal, I want us to talk about that animal a little bit, and then say, what is the lesson that Agur is trying to teach with each of these animals? We'll try to boil it down, and then we'll say, well, how does that connect to the different arenas of our lives? So let's start with the uninvited guest of every picnic, the ant. Verse 25, ants are creatures of little strength, yet they store up their food in the summer. Now, ants are not very impressive creatures. Any human being can walk up and with very little effort can knock over a whole ant pile that they have spent a long time working on. So in some ways, they are not very impressive, except for the Texas fire ant. I remember when we moved here 3 years ago, we learned the hard way about the Texas fire ant. We were in this field, and Nathan was over there, and all of a sudden he's crying because something's biting him, and so he decides to sit down. And by the time we could get over there, I mean, he was just covered in them. So, but this isn't talking about the Texas fire ant. This is talking about the normal ant. I think I've got a picture. Not very impressive creatures when you compare them to, say, our size. But they are actually quite phenomenal in a couple different characteristics. An ant, you probably know this, can maneuver 50 times its body weight. So it can pick up a scrap of food or a dead carcass, and it can drag it back to its home. 50 times its weight. That'd be like one of you going out in the parking lot and finding a small Hyundai and just sort of like picking it up and dragging it home. Quite impressive. And yet, that is not the piece of the ant that Agdor wants to draw our attention to. He encourages us to notice the ant's diligence. Even though they're small, even though they're not that impressive, even though that an ant will never shape the course of human history, they have a very exemplary trait. He says they store up their food in the summer. We would say things like, they know what time it is and they know what's coming. They've got an eye on the future. They know that today, while it exists for today, doesn't just exist for today. The wise person's wondering, how is what's going to happen today going to affect what's going to happen tomorrow? The ant's motto would be like that of the Boy Scouts. Be prepared. Look ahead. Now it's fascinating. The certain type of person in the book of Proverbs that's repeatedly encouraged to look at the ant is a person called the sluggard. A person with no initiative. A person we would say is lazy. A person who believes you can sort of drift your way into the life you want. You can just sort of float or cruise. And Agur would say, no, look at the ant. You don't stumble into the kind of future you want. You build it. An ant realizes what's going on today is not the only thing that I need to be concerned about. And so the ant looks to the future. And so let's just sort of boil it down to a lesson. I think in a phrase we could say, live today in light of tomorrow. That God's people should exercise foresight and discipline and industry and do it in a timely manner. Now, most of us in our culture are pretty much consumed with what's currently happening. Very seldomly do we take the time or the energy to sort of lift ourselves up and say, where is it that I want to end up? And what can I do today to sort of affect that course? The idea of the ant is this: the life is not static. That there will come a time where what I need in the future I could have only have brought about in the past. Now, most of us, I'm convinced, we sort of live life like a series of adrenaline shots. That in any given situation, we can sort of muster up enough adrenaline to sort of take what life throws at us. But this idea, the ant teaches us that life is a lot more like taking vitamins. Small, daily, incremental little changes that build a life that ends up getting where we want to be. The ant would encourage us to live for today in light of tomorrow. Now the question is, how are we doing that? Most would say that our culture doesn't have a lot of wisdom in this area. Delayed gratification is not something that we do very well. Most of the yeses and the nos that we say are usually in light of today and not in light of tomorrow. And yet we've all seen illustrations of people who have paid a high price today because of something they wanted down the road. If you have an athletic bent, you probably can think of lots of different athletes. The Larry Birds, the Tom Bradys, the Roger Federers, who their stories are legendary. You know, Larry Bird, where after all the rest of the team had showered and gone home, he's still shooting baskets thousands of baskets after practice because he wanted to end up in a different place than everybody else. Whatever you think of Tom Brady, he's legendary, and lots of people know some of the legendary stats, but very few know as much about the extreme regime he puts his body through to continue performing at a high level, or his strict diet. The ant's encouragement to us, the wisdom of Agur, is to live today in light of tomorrow. All of us at some point say, I want to arrive at a certain place. The ant says, what are you doing today to get you there? So then I began to ask myself, well, where does this connect to our lives? I think about educational decisions. Maybe these are decisions you're making right now, or maybe a decision you've made in the past, but at some point in education, we said, you know what, I'm going to invest the time and the energy because I want the opportunities and the future that this degree program can offer me. An obvious place this connects, and maybe your mind already went there, is sort of the topic of retirement. There will come a day when you cannot work, when I cannot work. And when that day comes, the provisions for that day are only going to come by setting aside what you have now. Now, our culture goes way overboard with this idea of retirement. Retire at 45, travel, and play golf the rest of your life. The Bible really has no concept of that kind of retirement. We are created to work and contribute. But there will come a day when we can't work at least at the same capacity we are now. And at that time, we could learn from the ant who stores up in the summer for when winter comes. This lesson of the ant, it connects any time that we see the course that we're headed on, and if we don't like it, we have to do something now to change that course. This has been a big topic of our road trip for Jen and me, both in areas of our marriage and in our parenting. Over the last couple years, we've seen some subtle habits, some subtle patterns, subtle shifts. One author, he'll talk about creeping separateness that can come in any relationship. And so something we've been talking about is some of these subtle shifts that have happened. What can we do now to sort of turn the ship a little bit so that we end up at a different place than where we are headed? What about the arena of your relationship with God? Most of us probably have hopes and aspirations that one day we are going to know God to a much greater extent than we do right now. A place where we can say with confidence, God, I love you with my whole heart. And we want to grow in our generosity towards God, with our time, with our money, with our skills. And the story of the ant says we're not going to just drift into that place. We're not just going to coast in our relationship with God and all of a sudden have the relationship with God that we really desire. The ant says it's going to take diligent effort. That there is something that we can do today to sort of get to that desired future. And it's small, little investments over time that make a huge impact. As I was looking at this, a question I asked myself is, did Jesus live this way? And there's that really famous verse in Hebrews 11 where it says, Jesus endured the cross because of the joy set before him. And I was thinking about that verse. You see what that's saying? It said Jesus took all those events that were swirling around his life, his arrest, the punishment he endured, the crucifixion. He endured all of that, which was very unpleasant because he could look to the future and see something beautiful, something that brought him great joy, that there would be a community of redeemed people. And so he was willing to go through in the present for what he wanted in the future. He paid the price. And the ant's encouragement is that we would all live like that we would live today in light of the future. All right, well, let's go to animal cage number 2. All of the lessons that are being taught here don't necessarily even relate to one another, but by looking at these different animals, we see elements of wisdom. And in verse 26, the animal number 2 is called the hyrax. Am I pronouncing that right? And you have a pet hyrax at home? Okay. Most of us are probably not going to be very familiar with this animal. Sometimes this is called a coney. Some of your versions of the Bible may have that. Sometimes a rock badger. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment, but look at verse 26. Agur says that these creatures are of little power, yet they make their home in the crags. Now, a crag is a way to refer to very steep, sort of rocky, rugged terrain. Here's a picture of a hyrax. Maybe you want to go get a pet like this. Now, this verse is not exaggerating when it says that a hyrax is an animal of little power. It doesn't have claws. Its teeth are nothing to write home about. Its size, it's about the size of a rabbit, so it's not scaring away any other animals because of its imposing size. It's got these little bitty ears and a bushy tail. Nothing is scared of a hyrax. This creature lives in the rocks of the Middle East, up in the mountains. But what's noteworthy about this animal is that it is extremely vulnerable. Eagles, hawks, mountain lions, wolves, all of them love the hyrax. So its ability to survive, it's not based on its strength or power, it's based on its ability to hide. And that's why the verse says, they make their home in the crags. Recognizing how vulnerable it is, it dives into tight little spaces where no predator can get at it. That's the only way it survives. So after learning a little bit about the hyrax, what's the lesson that Agur's trying to teach us here? And I think Agur's advice to us would be this: when vulnerable, make yourself inaccessible to predators. Or to say it another way, the best offense is a good defense. The hyrax discovered a long time ago, and maybe some of us are beginning to think this through, that there's nothing cowardly in running away from a fight you cannot win. It's a little counterintuitive for most of us who pride ourselves on being adequate, being strong, being able. The hyrax has no illusions of any of that. This rock badger says, in situations where I'm not going to win, I'm going to hide. I'm going to make myself inaccessible to predators around me. So the question that this raises for you and for me is, do we have any idea where we're vulnerable? Is there any sense in your mindset, in my mindset, as to what can take us out? What are the occasions where the ingredients of the situation are right, where we're going to say things and we're going to do things that later we're going to regret? Do we know what they are? And do we know how to hide from them? This is really fascinating to think about. It takes a lot of self-assessment to know, okay, I'm at my best in these situations and I am not at my best over there. And I need to take some serious steps to avoid doing things that I don't want to do. I'm a very task-oriented person. I really love to finish tasks. So if I get in the middle of some sort of task and some unforeseen problem comes up that makes it take twice as long or cost twice as much or maybe become unfinishable altogether, you don't really want to be around me in those situations. I have to be very careful when I'm in those situations that I don't say things and do things that I'm later going to regret. Most of us have learned something about ourselves, that when we're tired or when we're hungry, we're not very pleasant to be around. And so it's helpful in those situations to sort of disengage a little bit, to get some rest, so that we're of use to other people. For some of us, we have learned that with a credit card in a certain kind of store, it's not a good recipe. Do you know where you're vulnerable? I pay $11.99 a month for some software that sends every web page I ever look at to 3 of my closest friends. Do you know why I do that? Because I know I'm very vulnerable to a terrible predator called lust. And I don't want it to take me out. So every page I ever see, it sends it to 3 of my closest friends, and you know what? That really protects me. That helps me hide from this terrible predator. I really love recovery programs, AAA, Celebrate Recovery, whatever, all these different kind of 12-step programs there. So helpful. And if you talk to someone who's a recovering alcoholic and you ask them, hey, how long have you been sober? They can probably tell you down to the day. And then if you ask them, hey, when was the last time you went to a bar? They're just going to laugh at you because they know that is a very vulnerable place for them. So they don't go. Some of us do this with food. I don't know about you, but I can pretty much eat anything that's in front of me. I've said this before, if you ever want to kill off an entire church staff, drop off some poisonous cookies in the workroom. They'll be gone within 30 minutes and the whole staff will be wiped out. There's a great story about a guy who had a donut problem. He sort of got into the habit of every morning on his way to work stopping at the donut shop, picking up some donuts and going into work. Well, after a couple of years of doing that, you can imagine the physical health he was in. So he really became convicted of that and said, God, I'm going to stop doing that. And for a whole week, he went straight to work without stopping at the donut shop. And then, the next week rolled around, he sort of thought, one donut's not a big deal. And so he sort of prayed, God, if there's a spot open right in front of the donut shop, I'm going to take that as a sign from you I should stop. And sure enough, on the third time around the block, there was a spot right in front of the donut shop. For our whole married life, Jen and I have had a cookie jar in our house, but about 99% of the time, it stays empty. Now, there's nothing wrong with cookies in the cookie jar. They just don't stay that way in our house. Do you have any idea where you're vulnerable? And like the Hyrex, do you know how to hide? All right, there's a third animal, and this one is an insect. What we call a grasshopper. It's the locust. And here's what Agur says, verse 27. Locusts have no king, yet they advance together in ranks. In other words, when you look at them, nobody is scared of a single grasshopper. It's the group of them that makes them really scary. I tried to find a picture of a locust plague. There really weren't any great options, but this one maybe captures it a little bit. The idea that Agur is putting forth here is that a single one is no big deal. It's when they get together that there's a lot of trouble. And what's interesting about locusts is they don't have a king. They don't have any sort of recruiting. There's no sergeants sort of drilling orders into them. They just sort of get together. And when they get together, they are a very formidable force. Early at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, none of us remember this, but a swarm of locusts came across the Midwest of our country and caused about $500 million worth of damages to the states that grow most of the food for our country. You don't want to mess with locusts when they get together. And so if we try to think, okay, what's the lesson that Agur's trying to teach us about locusts, I think we could say it something like this, that we are never as formidable as when we are connected to others. And for those of us who are Christ followers, this is no problem for us because over and over and over again in the Bible, it teaches that we are not an isolated Christian. Yes, when we trust Christ, our faith is personal, but it is never meant to be just an individual activity. It's meant to be connected to others who follow Christ. We are His body. So you and I are never all that we're supposed to be. We're never as formidable as a force for God and His kingdom as when we're connected to the bugs next to us. So think about that for a moment. A couple months ago, in the spring, a couple dozen of us went to Llewellyn Merritt and spent a Saturday morning there, transforming the workroom, the break room, and one of the courtyards. If any one of us had tried to take that project on, it would have been way too much. But you put 30 of us together, and in 4 hours, we transformed that place. This happens in the mission trips. I know the middle schoolers just got back from their trip. Hopefully we'll hear more about that next week. The sheer finances alone of what it takes to send those groups, the high schoolers and the middle schoolers, on those trips, none of those families could have done that on their own. But you put a whole community around them that say, hey, yeah, we want you to have that experience. We want you to impact the world for Christ. And thousands of dollars were raised. I mean, this is why we have men's breakfast once a month and a women's Bible study group on Tuesday and community groups that meet through the week. Because we know that we are better together than when we're on our own. And the locust is just Agar's way of saying, don't forget that. And that is why so often we unashamedly stand up here and we ask you to join in the work that God's doing both in our church and around our church. I mean, this is not a church just to come and sort of receive. Yes, come. But this is a place where we know that we are better together when we're all actively engaged in God's kingdom work. It's better. We're the body, and we're never as formidable as when we're together. All right, there's one more animal, the lizard. Verse 28, the lizard can be caught with the hand, yet it is found in kings' palaces. Now, I've got to tell you, this is the one that has me scratching my head. I've even had more time to think about this sermon than most sermons, and even with all that extra time, I'm still a little bit puzzled when it comes to what Agar's trying to teach us about the lizard. And I'm in pretty good company, because as I've been researching other commentators and things, most people are pretty confused about this one. So let's just talk about lizards a little bit. Here's a picture of no, not that one. Actually, it's not really that bad of a depiction, because look at the next slide. I mean, they basically look about the same. Lizards are very weird-looking animals. They've got these little suction cups on their hands that make it so they can sort of scamper up walls and trees. And, living in Texas, you know a lot about lizards, right? You have them all over. It's taken me a little while to get used to having lizards in our home and in our garage and in our backyard. They're everywhere. So we can really relate to this verse. So what is this all about? Again, there's not a ton of clarity, but I'm going to give you my best guess after thinking about this for a few weeks and reading on this. Agar says you can catch a lizard with your hands. Okay, so lizards are not escape artists. They're not sort of out of sight. It's not that you can't see them or find them. He says you can catch them with your hands. And yet, they are found in kings' palaces. So here's the deal. If you can catch them with your hands, you could get rid of them. If the king said, I don't want any lizards in my palace, guess what? There wouldn't be any lizards in the palace, because you can catch them with your hands. So, why do you find lizards in the king's palace? Because the king has decided, I want lizards in my palace. It doesn't tell us why. It just says you could catch them, but you find them in king's palaces. Now, what do you call it when something as disgusting looking as a lizard is found in a king's palace? I call it grace. Maybe Agar is saying something like this, that we never fully understand the merciful and extravagant love of God, so just bask in it. Or more succinctly, we could say, grace happens. The lesson from this animal is not as much that he wants us to act on something or sort of model our actions off this animal, as much as he wants what's being modeled to act on us. So, for ants, we're supposed to ask, okay, am I like an ant? Am I being diligent? Or the hyrax, do I know where I'm vulnerable? And do I know how to hide? Am I taking defensive steps? Or am I connected to others? Am I leveraging the other believers that are around me? Are we moving as this great body of Christ? But now you come to this one, the lizard, and I think he's hoping that we're asking, do I know how I got here? Do I know why I'm welcome in the palace of the king? I don't know how you got here today. And I would guess all of us in here have two things in common. One, when we come into a place like this, my guess is most of us, we know how lizardly we are. Now, we don't often show that to each other, right? We often do our best to try to clean ourselves up and try to hide the fact that we struggle with anger, or that we're more selfish than we ought to be, or that we're really struggling with greed, or whatever it is. We often try to hide some of that, but we know. Each of us knows how lizardly we are. And when we come into this place, most of us say to God, yep, That's who I am. But the second thing we're really hopeful when we come into a place like this is we want to catch a glimpse of a God who knows us exactly as we are and yet accepts us and loves us and invites us into his presence in spite of all that. We really are lizards in the palace of a king. And that only happens because he wants it to. It's all on him, not on us. It's grace. And so hopefully this morning, as we've sung the songs we've sung, as we've acknowledged God's work in our lives, as we've been bold enough to believe that he wants us in his family, that he wants to use us in the world, as crazy as it is to believe sometimes that there's an extravagant grace available like that, this proverb encourages us. Hold on to that. I mean, this is the whole reason Jesus came to our plan. I want to finish with this verse in Romans 5. Listen to this verse. It really reminds me of what Agar's saying about the lizard. He says, therefore, since we have been justified through faith. It happened because we believed, not because we did anything. We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Now that's amazing all by itself. That things are no longer at odds between me and God. That his son came and he died, and because I placed my faith in what he did for me, things are good between me and God. But that's not all. Through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. We are lizards in the palace, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Every person in this room can say, I'm a lizard. I've made some stupid mistakes. I have made some very unwise choices, and I am paying the huge price for those even now. And then God comes and says to us over and over again, yeah, but you can live in my palace. My grace is available to you. It's yours. It's ready for the taking. Because I want you to have it. I want you in my family. I want you to know you're accepted. So here's Agar's encouragement to us. He asks us to sit at the feet, if we can find them, to sit at the feet of the ant, of the hyrax, the locust, and the lizard, and just amaze yourself at what God might teach you. Pray with me.